Good day. A meeting of G7 foreign ministers took place in London the other day, chaired by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. This meeting of G7 ministers brings together the foreign ministers of the key countries that, taken together, form the Western Alliance, what the Chinese and the Russians are increasingly referring to as the so-called collective West. The G7 was, for a brief period, combined or functioned alongside an entity known as the G8. The G8 was the G7 plus one other country, which was Russia. Contrary to what many think, Russia was never actually a member of the G7. It never, for example, participated in the economic discussions which take place between G7 states, but it was invited to G7 summits and was availed the opportunity to discuss foreign policy issues there, at which point, during those particular sessions when Russia participated, it was called the G8. The Russians, by the way, always deeply resented the fact that they were excluded from many of the most important discussions. In 2014, they were booted out of the G8 in connection with the events in Ukraine and Crimea, and have never shown the slightest desire ever to rejoin that format. On the contrary, they have always made clear their absolute and adamant refusal never to do so. It is perhaps testimony to the surreal quality of these G7 meetings that the preamble to the communique that is published at the end of these meetings always starts by saying that Russia was not invited to participate in these meetings. The Russians have repeatedly said that if they were invited to participate and, in effect, reconstitute the G8, they would completely refuse to do so, and that they're not interested in this format anymore. But the Western powers pretend not to hear this and pretend to say that Russia has not been invited, not invited to a format which it will never join, which it chooses not to join. Well, that is one aspect of the surreal quality of these meetings. And I had decided that I would do a video on the topic of this latest G7 meeting because it was a particular exercise in fatuity and empty rhetoric. But Global Times, the unofficial voice of the Chinese government, beat me to it with an exceptionally hard-hitting editorial. And it is this editorial which I propose to discuss in this program. Before doing so, however, I will read it out in full because, again, to my mind, it says a great deal about the G7 and about the situation, the condition of the Western Alliance and of the United States, but it also says a great deal about China and the relationship that China now has with Russia and the extraordinary self-confidence that the Chinese are now bringing to their conduct of international relations. This is what the editorial says, and I'm going to read it in full. G7 foreign ministers issued a 12,400-word communique after 3 days of meetings in London. Among various topics of no substance, China and Russia were the real focus. Just as many Western media outlets said, the communique criticized China and Russia, but it lacked substantial actions against the two countries. This also demonstrates that the US efforts to rally allies against China don't have much energy, but are like an arrow at the end of its flight. Hegemony is the lifeblood of the United States. The United States is still the world's most powerful country in terms of comprehensive strength and has superpower dominance over the world. The problem with Washington is that it is too greedy. Its demands for hegemony have gone far beyond its capabilities, and the US has fallen into an unprecedented sense of crisis and confusion. As such, the strength of the world's strongest country seems to be not enough to meet its demands, and a large deficit in mobilization capacity appears. The following are what the United States is most worried about. First, the continuous development and expanding strength of China will challenge the US's overwhelming advantages. If China is bogged down or falls into chaos, and this trend proves to be irreversible, then Washington will heave a sigh of relief and get assured. However, the common forecast of the world is that China will continue to develop, and it's only a matter of time that China's economic aggregate exceeds that of the United States. For some US elites, China's rise is equivalent to a geopolitical event akin to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Second, the US alliance system is not as useful as it appears to be, with some important allies only responding to Washington in ideology, but reluctant to take real actions to support Washington in encircling China. As the China market grows bigger and bigger, trade between many US allies and China has already surpassed those between them and the US, and the tendency will further aggravate. Washington will find it more difficult to mobilize those allies to make self-sacrifice for the common interests of the West. Third, the China-Russia strategic partnership of coordination may continue to deepen so that the two countries will become real allies in confronting US hegemony. This will lead to more uncertainties in the US-China-Russia game. US efforts to rally allies have almost hit the ceiling. Their unity is like the last few drops of water in a sponge. Almost nothing is left. It's believed no US ally is willing to confront China and Russia simultaneously, as doing that is almost equivalent to strategic suicide. That's why Washington softened some of its rhetoric against China and Russia during the G7 meetings, and has had to make some ideological show to demonstrate the West shares hatred towards common enemies. There is still a lot of room for China-Russia cooperation. Our sponge has just been fully soaked with water. China and Russia could make more diplomatic coordination in opposing hegemony and take counteractions against US attempts to strengthen alliances. The two can also tap the huge potential for economic complementarity. In addition, the two countries have just begun in moving closer to each other militarily. If necessary, there could be a lot of cooperation that causes shocks. The US greed for hegemony has caught it up in a difficult strategic overdraft. Many empires in history have experienced such quagmires. China and Russia have acquired some kind of initiative as they pursue their reasonable and controllable interests in a pragmatic manner. The US pressure on both China and Russia, as a matter of fact, has failed. China and Russia have the capabilities to sabotage the US strategy. The degree of intimacy between the US and its allies is not enough to increase the US strength in dealing with China and Russia. It only serves as a bluff. But it's totally not difficult for China and Russia to maintain the current cooperation with their Western countries. There is also the possibility that they can continue to deepen cooperation. It's much easier for China and Russia to disintegrate the US alliance system and make it invalid than for the US to strengthen the system to unleash new lethal energy. As long as China and Russia don't make mistakes, do their own things well, reinforce comprehensive strategic cooperation with each other, and continuously deepen integration with the world, the United States will have no chance to realize its ambition. Although Washington won the Cold War in the 21st century, there is no way it can replicate that unexpected victory. Now, that is an extraordinary editorial, and as I said, it is one which comes from Global Times, which is the unofficial voice of the Chinese government. So let's just unpack it and see how valid it is. Firstly, it's absolutely true, the point that it makes, that the G7 summit came up with a 12,400 word communique, which said nothing of significance about any topic, and which lacked any substantial action against either China or Russia, is absolutely true. It's also true that the United States was forced to dial down its rhetoric against China and Russia. And of course, at this moment in time, as we know, the United States and the administration are talking about the need to de-escalate with Moscow, and that is their major topic of discussion now. And then we come to perhaps the more interesting points that the article makes, because of course, the underlying point the editorial is making is that the United States, still very powerful though it is, lacks the power to take on China and Russia together. China's power is increasing all the time by leaps and bounds, and it will soon overtake the United States as the world's biggest economy. In fact, as some of you may remember from my discussion of Tony Blinken's interview with CBS 60 Minutes, Blinken himself accepted that by 2028, China will have the biggest economy in the world in nominal terms, having surpassed that of the United States. Of course, in purchasing power parity terms, China's economy is already bigger, and in terms of its manufacturing capacity, it is very much bigger. So what Global Times says is that the United States lacks the resources by itself to take on China and Russia at the same time. And it quite correctly says that the only answer the United States has to this enormous combination of Chinese and Russian power is through its alliance system. It is trying to enlist its allies in Europe and in the Far East, in the so-called Quad, to join it in this campaign against China and Russia, since that is the only way it can, in effect, continue with its current world hegemony. But the editorial then goes on to say that even this alliance system is insufficient. Its resources do not match the aggregate resources that the Chinese and the Russians can bring to bear. what the article, the editorial, refers to the complementarity between the Chinese and Russian economies, which is only in effect now starting to have a genuine effect. And moreover, and perhaps even more seriously for Washington, an increasing number of the US's own allies not only sense this, not only have a realization that the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership or de facto alliance, and it's interesting, by the way, that the Global Times editorial admitted that there may come a time when China and Russia could become real, in other words, open allies. Anyway, the US worries that some of its allies are starting to sense that even the combination of the United States and its alliance system are not sufficient to take on Russia and China together. The article, in fact, says it's believed no US ally is willing to confront China and Russia simultaneously, as doing that is almost equivalent to strategic suicide. And it also goes on to say that not only do many of the United States' own allies recognize this, but some of these allies are becoming increasingly tempted to switch sides. Now, it's very careful not to say which ones, though it's not difficult to guess that Germany may be the country that the Chinese are most thinking about. But its point is that China, because of its bigger economy than the United States, is already becoming a larger and more lucrative market for some of the US's allies than is the US itself. That describes Germany, and that is why I think that it is Germany that the Global Times is referring to primarily when it says this. However, that may be true of certain other countries within the US's alliance system. France and Italy also spring to mind. We will see. It also makes the point that, in fact, the Chinese and the Russians are not only in economic aggregate more powerful, but they are in military aggregate potentially more powerful than the United States and any combination of the United States and its allies as well. And that, by the way, is almost certainly true. The Chinese are rapidly building up the most powerful fleet in the Pacific. Both China and Russia have very powerful air forces. Russia has a nuclear deterrent capability comparable in every respect to that of the United States. And it has, as I discussed in a recent program, the most powerful land military on the European continent, one which the analyst Scott Ritter, a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, conceded is stronger than anything that NATO can throw at it. So, this is an enormous challenge that the United States is facing. But Global Times is careful to say that the United States itself does have an option. It does not need to take on China and Russia simultaneously. The Chinese and the Russians are not looking for a fight with the United States on any issue. And I'm inclined, by the way, to believe that is true. Tony Blinken, in his interview with CBS 60 Minutes, spoke about how China is seeking global dominance. As I said in my video discussing that interview, I do not know of a single comment to that effect by any Chinese political leader at all. And I'm very skeptical that that is actually China's intention. The Chinese seem to be saying in this editorial that for the time being, they're prepared to go along with the fact that the United States will remain for a certain period of time the most powerful country in the world, even if China overtakes it economically, and if China and Russia in aggregate are militarily more powerful than the United States and its allies, the United States will still have an unrivaled combination of capabilities, technological, military, and economic, which will continue to maintain it as the world's most powerful country, at least for some time. The Chinese and their Russian ally are not looking for a fight with the United States. But, as Global Times says, the problem is not the preeminent position of the United States in the global system. It is that the United States is, as Global Times says, greedy. It doesn't want to be the first amongst equals in an international concert of great powers. It wants to be the hegemonic power. It wants to be at the center of what it calls the rules-based international system. In other words, a system where the United States decides the rules and everyone else complies with it. And what Global Times is saying, and again, I reiterate, it is the voice of the Chinese government. What Global Times is saying is that the United States simply does not have the means or the resources to fulfill that objective. It is, in effect, a demand by the United States for power, global power, without limits, and that requires limitless resources, which the United States simply does not have. Up against the combined might of China and Russia, it has no chance to achieve this overambitious objective that it has set itself. In fact, Global Times talks about the United States facing a strategic overdraft, a overcommitments crisis, a situation where its whole position is becoming overextended, triggering, incidentally, a crisis of confidence within the United States itself. There is, of course, for the Chinese and the Russians, a warning here. I mean, Global Times makes it very clear that China believes that this relationship with Russia is the key for both countries to maintain their independent space. It seeks to have this alliance forged ever more deeply. It comes up with this extraordinarily vivid metaphor that whilst the Western alliance is a sponge that has run out of water so that there is no water left to squeeze out of it, no more power in effect left to squeeze out of it, the Russian-Chinese alliance, on the contrary, is just getting started. It is a sponge full of water, which has vast amounts of water that can be gushed out, vast amounts of power that can be gushed out. But its primary warning is that the Chinese and the Russians should not act in any reckless or foolhardy way. Essentially, they can wait. Time is in their favor. As long as China and Russia don't make mistakes, do their own things well, reinforce comprehensive strategic coordination with each other, and continuously deepen integration with the world, the US will have no chance to realize its ambition. Well, I think that is an absolutely perfect summary of the state of things. It's extraordinarily interesting that the Chinese leadership understands it, and is able to express it in such a clear-sighted way. The Western alliance is, as they say, like an arrow at the end of its flight. It may look impressive as it moves, but actually there is no force or energy behind it. Its inability to respond forcefully against China and Russia in economic terms, the way its bluff has been called this spring over the situation in Ukraine, a fact I've discussed many times in programs on this channel, the fact that the United States really has no options, no effective military options in Taiwan, the fact that China is due to overtake the US economy, even in nominal terms, by the end of this decade, the fact that both the Chinese and Russian militaries are growing stronger, and that Russia itself has in effect made itself sanctions proof, the fact that both the Russians and the Chinese have now hardened their financial systems so that they can operate outside the constraints of the global financial system controlled by the United States. All of this gives them time and space, and all they need to do is wait. They have strategic depth. The United States and its allies don't. Ultimately, it is for the United States to decide which course it wants to take. Does it want to come to some kind of, in effect, geopolitical ceasefire with the Russians and the Chinese? Will it accept the reality that the world has changed, that it cannot be the undisputed hegemon anymore, that the unipolar moment that emerged briefly after the Cold War has passed, that there is now a new international system and a new balance of power in the world? Will it accept that? In which case it can take various steps to sort out its own internal problems and can continue for a time to remain the world's most preeminent and important country? Or will it continue the policy of confrontation with China and Russia, see its alliances start to unravel and start to fall apart, both in Europe and in the Pacific? And by the way, Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran have made programs about how the US alliance systems in the Pacific are also starting to look increasingly fragile. Does the United States in effect double down on policies that are failing and which objectively cannot succeed, bringing disaster upon itself? Or will it seek peace and accommodation? Well, we shall see. I have to say that I hope very much it will be the second. I say that as somebody who is a great admirer of the United States, who admires its constitution and its achievements, and who wishes well for the country. But the reality of what the Chinese are saying is absolutely right, and it will be the disastrous course that the US will take if it chooses to continue in its confrontational policies against China and Russia for much longer. I am sorry to say that even though I hope that the United States and its leadership will follow the wiser course of peace and accommodation, I worry that in reality it will instead be a policy of confrontation and challenge and attempted containment. In that case, it will not end well. Not for China or Russia, perhaps, but for the United States, though possibly, and along the way, the entire peace of the world may become endangered. I'm going to finish with a quotation from the great Arab thinker and writer Ibn Khaldun, which I think is a warning to the United States of the risks that it's running. Ibn Khaldun wrote at the end of the 14th century, and he spoke about what happens at the end of a dynasty. And he said this: at the end of a dynasty, there often appears some show of power. It lights up brilliantly just before it is extinguished, like a burning wick, the flames of which leaps up brilliantly a moment before it goes out, giving the impression that it is just starting to burn when it is in fact going out. Well, I hope that for the United States' sake, it's not a case of the US wick going out. Thank you for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and I would ask you also to check out our main channel where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our various new platforms, Odyssey, SuperTube, and Locals. And please also check us out, or rather support us via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. I realize that for some people the latter is difficult, but it's also a challenge for us to try to keep channels like this going. So any help that you can provide us with is much appreciated. And can I also say that we accept payments and donations in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. Don't also forget to go to our Discord server and check out our shop and the wonderful things that you will find there. Our amazing magic mugs, our wonderful hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And I hope you enjoyed this program and found it informative. And I thank you for joining me on it. And I look forward to you joining me on my next program, and have a wonderful day until then.